Good evening, good afternoon. It's 1:30 in England, 6 o'clock with you in Mumbai in India. Nice to meet you all, or to see you all, see your names at least. Anyway, okay. So my title of my presentation is the Indian Army in the Second World War: Untold Stories from Europe, and that's the. You can see the covers of my two books there. One on the left, the Indian Contingent, that was published in 2020 during the lockdown time, and on the right, the Great Épinal Escape, that came out earlier this year. And I've been looking at this subject for about 10 years now. It's been a long research process for me. Yeah, so to kind of dive in. So this presentation is going to cover a sort of general introduction to the Indian Army in the Second World War. And then I'm going to talk about Force K6 at Dunkirk. And I'm going to talk about prisoners of war, and in particular, the camp at Épinal, which is in France. And then I'm going to give one story about one particular prisoner, Jalal, and then there'll be some time for questions. I'm aiming to take around 40 minutes or so, 40 to 45 minutes. And I'm sure AJ will rein me in if I'm going on too long, or encourage me to say more if I'm not saying enough. So yeah, so let's get started. So this lovely photograph of this Indian soldier arriving, I think that's arriving at Singapore. Quite a well-known photo, that one. So the Indian Army in the Second World War was around 2.5 million men. And as there was no conscription in India during the Second World War, this makes it the largest volunteer army that has ever been seen. So that's quite a substantial amount. And there were also 11,500 women in the Women's Auxiliary Corps India, as it was called. The officers in the Indian Army were mostly white British officers at the start of the war. As the war went on, there were more and more Indians who had been trained or had reached the officer ranks, and that was a kind of an unfolding, a process of Indianization, as it was called. And the Indian Army fought in all of the major campaigns that the British Army were involved in, with the exception of Northwest Europe after D-Day. So they were involved in East Africa, in North Africa, very much in Italy, and of course in the campaigns in Burma and elsewhere in Asia. And they won 31 Victoria Crosses. So that gives you a sense of the contribution there of the Indian Army. Many of them were taken prisoner in both in Asia and in Europe. And I'll talk about some of the European prisoners in a bit. As well as the army, of course, there was also the Royal Indian Navy, as it was known then, and the Indian Air Force, and thousands of Lascars as well. So Indian men who were in the merchant navy. So they were sailors not in the navy, not in the Royal Navy, but in the navy that was delivering supplies across the empire, as they had been, of course, before the war and for many decades before that. And some of those Lascars became prisoners of war also. And in 1947, of course, the Indian Army was split and became two armies: the Pakistan Army and what is now called the Indian Army. And of course, it's also worth mentioning the Azad Hind Fauj, or the Indian National Army, or as it was in Germany, the Legion Freies Indien, which was recruited by Subhas Chandra Bose and others as well, and fought against the British. I'm not going to be talking about them really, but just to acknowledge that they were there. Okay, so that's the general kind of Indian Army during the Second World War. Now, Force K6. So this was the subject of my first book. Force K6, known as the first in the field. This is a great photo taken of them in Marseille, in a venue that I just recently visited, actually. So the British Army was in France at the beginning of the Second World War. in the autumn of 1939 until the summer of 1940. And they found that they needed mule transport for difficult conditions. So conditions when it might be very cold, unfrozen, or where it might be very steep, or where they needed to keep quiet, or very muddy. So when you can't get road transport to work, when you can't get motor transport to work, then you need animal transport, as indeed is still the case in some armies now. The Indian Army included, and the Pakistan Army and the French Army, in fact. So the British Army had come to France without any animal transport. This motto was "not a horse in the force." So they had come with the idea of being only motorized transport. And then they changed their mind and thought, no, we will need some animal transport. And so they called on the Empire. They called on the Royal Indian Army Service Corps, which was sometimes known as the Rice Corps. And their job is supply and transport. And so 4 companies were sent from India. So the 22nd, 25th, 29th, and 32nd Animal Transport Companies and some supporting units sailed from Mumbai on the 10th of December 1939 and arrived at Marseille on the 26th of December. And at this stage, there were 1,723 men and 2,000 animals. And I'm going to show you a bit of film now. So hopefully this will work with the sound. So this is some footage of them arriving at Marseille and unloading from the ships.
To France, these are the first pictures to be released of the arrival of a contingent of Indian troops. Once again, these hardy little men from the hills and the plains have come to fight for Britain in their own individual way. And Germany well knows that there are no more fearless fighters in the world. They have brought to France their own food, their water carriers and their mules, and the mules don't think much of us. This rich jewel of the Empire's crown is given without stint to the cause of the Allies. Princes and Rajas have offered their wealth and their swords. The sons of the Raj have offered their strength and their loyalty to the King Emperor. From Lahore and Calcutta they have come, from Delhi, from Hyderabad and Bhopal. From the Arabian Sea to the Bay of Bengal, India stands with Britain.
Wonderful bit of propaganda film there. India stands with Britain, hurrah! And this kind of, from the Arabian Gulf to Bhopal and so on. Actually, the men were almost entirely from Punjab and were almost entirely Muslims. But that's a great bit of film that shows you the way they were presented, and kind of underlines the importance that Force K6 had, which was this sort of double role, really, a military role in terms of supply and transport, but also a propaganda role, also a role that was saying it's important for Britain to have the Empire support, and it's important to show to India that that support exists as well. That bit of footage is newsreel footage that was shown in Britain, and later on I'll be showing you a bit of newsreel that was shown in India. So this is now a couple of photos from as they settled in. So the 4 companies were sent to different parts of France. 2 of them up to northern France. 1 company stayed in Marseille for a while, and then later was sent to the front line. And the 4th company was sent to Le Mans, which is in the center of France. So this is from the 25th company near the city of Lille. And this is in a lot later now. This is in April of 1940. So having been through a very harsh winter, they're now coming into the spring. The weather's improving, and they are sharing and celebrating with the local people. So these 2 photos come from the same series of photos. On the right, you see the men dancing. This is probably Bhangra. And on the left, you see the spectators. So you can see the soldiers at the front sitting down. They've got some children on their laps, local French children. And behind them, the French civilians looking on. There's a woman in the middle there clapping, who's got really very bad teeth indeed. And then there's a French gendarme, a policeman behind. This is a lovely photo. I like this photo for showing the kind of the warmth that existed between these men and the civilians that they were meeting. here in France. And this is around the end of April of 1940, when they are in this period that was known as the phony war before. So the war was declared. You know, the Germans were on one side of the border, the French, the Belgians were, and the British were waiting. There was no kind of military activity or no major military activity happening, but this process of waiting is happening. And then, so just before we come to that, so this is some more photos of them as propaganda poster boys. On the left, they were of course all fitted with gas masks, as were all troops in the Second World War, but the gas masks also had to come for the mules. So on the left you see the mule gas mask and the man gas mask together. On the right, they, at the end of April, some of them went to for leave in Britain, and you will see this photo on the right is a visit to the Houses of Parliament. You can see Major Muhammad Akbar Khan is the one with the cap, the peaked cap. He was their senior Indian officer, and then the man in the black suit with the white flower is a British MP, member of Parliament, and next to him, on his left, is Risaldar Major Ashraf Khan. So these men were having a brief leave in England, and they were still there. These small group were still there in England on the 10th of May. And the 10th of May was the Blitzkrieg, the beginning of the Lightning War. And there's a painting. On the left is a painting of Muhammad Akbar Khan that was painted the following year in England. So on the 10th of May, the Germans attacked France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and very quickly they broke through. Very quickly they defeated the British and the French armies, and there was a general retreat towards the Channel coast, towards the ports. And particularly Dunkirk was the famous port where, over a period of 9 days, over 300,000 British and French troops were evacuated successfully and taken back to Britain. And the 32nd, amongst them were these 32nd Company and the 25th Company. And the 25th Company was led by Major Muhammad Akbar Khan along the beach on the 28th of May. Meanwhile, most of the rest of the men left France through Saint-Nazaire, which is further down on the west coast of France. And that was quite a bit later, a few weeks later. And the 22nd Company, however, became prisoners of war because they had been posted up on the Maginot Line north of Metz, in the north of France, and they were cut off, and they tried to escape going southeastwards towards Switzerland, but they were eventually taken prisoner. 5 men were killed and are buried in France, and they are 5 amongst many Indian soldiers who were buried across Europe, whose graves are looked after by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. And there are some graves not far from here where I live in Exeter in the southwest of England. So yeah, this evacuation, leaving France, and then they're safe in Britain. This photo is from Scotland a couple of years later. And then they were reinforced. So 3 more companies came out to join them in May of 1941, and they were posted in various often quite mountainous parts of Britain. So in the southwest, where I am, in Wales in the west, and up in Scotland. And this was training for what was called Operation Jupiter. So Operation Jupiter was an idea for an attack, an idea that never happened, an idea that Winston Churchill had, that it would be good to attack Norway and to try to, in order to protect the sea convoys that were going from Scotland round to the Soviet Union, round to the Arctic ports of Russia. And then Churchill had this idea to do a seaborne attack on the Norwegian coast to attack the airfields where the German Luftwaffe, the Air Force, were attacking, and then, as he put it, to unroll the map of Europe from north to the south. So that would be an attack, and in these snowy mountainous conditions, you would need animal transport. Operation Jupiter never happened. It never came to fruition, but it was Churchill's idea. So these men were working and training with British infantry brigades in different parts of the country. And then by January 1944, when it was clear that that was not going to happen, and instead there would be the attack on Normandy and D-Day in June of 1944. So the Force K6, the remaining men of Force K6, went back to India in January 1944, sailing back to your hometown of Mumbai and arriving there in the beginning of 1944. And then some of them were then used in Burma. So I'm now going to show you a little bit more film. This is from a place called Ashbourne, which is in the middle of England. This is from August of 1940. And this was a bit of film that was shown in India. So the commentary was by Z.A. Bukhari, who was then working for the BBC in London. And later he went on to work for Pakistan Radio in Karachi. And this was footage that was shown in India, and this is from a piece of a long, about 10 minutes long bit of film that you can find quite easily on YouTube, and I can give you the link to that later if you like. So this is unusual. I'll show you a little section, but it's unusual and it shows you the men praying. So it's the only bit of film of these guys praying that I've found.
अब जवान अपनी कामयाबी की दुआ मांगने के लिए खुद खुदा के दरबार में हाजिर हुए हैं। कुछ जवान तंबू खड़ा कर रहे हैं। मिस्टर तंबू खड़े हो गए। ये तंबू किस लिए है? अखबार पढ़ने के लिए? जी नहीं। जी हाँ, इक्का। साफे की सफाई, सर की सफाई कैंची से, सर की सफाई हाथ से। लात ना मारना भाई, ना भाई खच्चर। किसी बड़ी हस्ती के तशरीफ लाने की तैयारियां हो रही हैं। बादशाह सलामत और मलिका साहिबा मुआयने के लिए तशरीफ लाना चाहते हैं। ये मेजर मोहम्मद अकबर खान साहब हैं। बादशाह सलामत तशरीफ ले आए। ये रिसालदार मेजर मोहम्मद अशरफ खान साहब हैं। मौलवी साहिबान नजराना पेश कर रहे हैं।
So I'll move on from that one. Yeah, so fascinating bit of film there. Just extraordinary bit of film and great commentary by Bukhari there, and interesting the very playful note he has in the commentary. And then you see the king and the queen walking up and down and inspecting and meeting many of the men. In fact, a lot of them met the king more than once. I mean, there were, I think, at least 3 occasions when the king visited them in different parts of the country. So that's the kind of the main bit I'm going to tell you about what was in my first book. So about Force K6 in Britain and in Europe, and a really fascinating story of cross-cultural armies. When there was this kind of enormous history and tradition of British soldiers who had been posted to India, from the 18th century onwards in all different parts, and then this very strong British presence there that went through the 20th century up until 1947. And then these men were going in the opposite direction. They were included the only soldiers ever from the Indian Army to have been posted to Britain. So really quite an extraordinary experience that they had, and generally very favourable experience they had. I mean, there's lots of stories that I found about them in Britain, which were very positive, which I haven't got time to go into now. But yeah, anyway, so moving on from that, so then the story of the prisoners. So as I said, the 22nd Company of the Royal Indian Army Service Corps was captured in France, and then they became among the 15,000 Indian Army prisoners of war who had been mostly captured in North Africa. So the photo here is a photo from North Africa showing what may be, I think, Marathas, this is a German photograph, who were captured possibly at Meshli or at Tobruk. There were also Indian Army soldiers who were captured in Greece, a few of them, and indeed some who'd been caught earlier in Ethiopia, who'd been transferred to Europe, as well as some later in the war who were captured in Italy. Most of them were put in camps in Italy initially, after having been caught in North Africa, then taken to Italy, and then on into Germany. That was the kind of fairly common experience. So here's a Mumbai story for you. So Jimmy Vakil, a story that is, again, largely unknown. He was born in 1915, and he lived for a very long life. I hope that his daughter may be on this call. I'm not sure if she made it in the end, but I met her last year when I was in Mumbai. So he was a lieutenant in the Royal Indian Army Service Corps, and in 1941 he was posted to Egypt. He was captured the following year at Fuka. He was taken as a prisoner. He was taken to Italy. So he was an officer. Okay, so he was one of a number of Indian Army officers in the Indian Army who were captured and were imprisoned together in Italy. He escaped 3 times, but he never managed to make it home. He never managed to make it back to the Allied lines. And then he was sent. Went on and was sent as a prisoner to Germany as well. He recalled, among the many other things that he recalled, was that each of the prisoners were given a copy of Mein Kampf, Hitler's book, in English, and his copy was eaten by termites. He stayed in the army for many years after the war, and he became a brigadier, and he retired in 1980. And his story is untold, but I will mention that his daughter has his prisoner of war logbook, which is an absolutely fascinating. She showed it to me, an absolutely fascinating book, recording his diary, really, and his encounters with other prisoners, some of whom became quite famous in the army during and after the war. So that's a story that really, another untold story that really deserves to be told fully. So here's some photos of Indian Army prisoners of war. So this is Stalag 12A in Limburg. So Stalag is a German word meaning a Stammlager. So it's a standing camp. It's a sort of standard camp not for officers, but for ordinary soldiers. So this is in Limburg, which is sort of in the western part of Germany. In January 1944, these photographs were taken by the Red Cross. The Red Cross had the responsibility to visit every camp on a regular basis. And when they did that, they often took photos. So that's where some of the many interesting photos that I found of Indian Army prisoners of war, they came from the Red Cross. These are a couple of typical photos of leisure activities. So on the right, you have the tug of war between the Sikhs and the others. It is not recorded who won that particular Sikh tug of war, but I don't know. I'll leave you to try and guess. And on the left, the library photo. So obviously, you know, um, these are men with time on their hands to some extent. It's interesting because the if you've ever seen any prisoner of war movies, you know that then there's a strong sense that a lot of prisoners of war have a lot of time on their hands to dig tunnels, to play games, and to do all kinds of sports and so forth, and indeed to read books. However, if that's the case, that was the case for officers, but not the case for the other ranks. And the vast majority of the Indian Army soldiers were not officers because they were generally required to work. The Geneva Convention allowed the imprisoning power to put them to work, and in many cases they did. As was, of course, the reverse of that. I mean, there were many Italian prisoners of war who were held in camps across different parts of India, and many of those were used to work. So yeah, so the great photo of the library. There were many little organisations and charities that were sending books to the prisoners of war. So that's Stalag 12A, and then this is the camp which I'm most interested in, Front Stalag 315 Épinal. So this was a camp. The Front Stalag was a camp that was outside of Germany itself, so either in France or Poland or other countries. And from the beginning of 1944, this place called Épinal had a special camp just for Indian prisoners of war, just for Indian non-officer prisoners of war. So on the left, you see a postcard, in fact, of the camp before it was a camp. So this is a French postcard. It was built as a barracks for French soldiers. The buildings, the gates, and the two buildings on either side of the gate, they still exist. I've been there and seen the place. In fact, there was a ceremony there back in May, to remember the Indian prisoners, and it took place just behind those gates. So it was built as a barracks for French soldiers, and then when Germany invaded and conquered France, it became a prisoner of war camp. So this is right up in the northeast corner of France. So it's sort of quite close to Strasbourg, which is on the River Rhine, which divides France from Germany. And it's on this Épinal itself is on the River Moselle, and it's kind of got mountains to the east of it. And the photo on the right is another Red Cross photo showing some of the Indian Army soldiers in the winter. So the Red Cross visited in February of 1944, found these 3,200 men. So they were none of them. Well, there were two officers, or rather, Viceroy's commissioned officers among the prisoners. But apart from that, they were sergeants, sergeant majors, and downwards from there. They were from across India. They included quite a lot of Gurkhas as well. They were Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs and Christians, and they were, as was common in the Indian Army, they were divided by religion. So the different buildings had there was a different building for each of the different religions. That's February 1944. This is also the same month. On the right, you see the medical staff. So they had two doctors. I think I haven't had a definite identification, but I think the one on the extreme left of the photo is a Scottish doctor, and the one next to him is an Indian doctor called Seal, who was from Calcutta. I know those names. I've tried to match them up with the photo. So there were two doctors at that stage, two doctors for 3,000 prisoners, and later on they had another doctor and nursing staff and attendants, helpers, but no dentist. So generally, there should be dentists in every. There were supposed to be dentists in every prisoner of war camp. Because there was no dentist in this camp, the men would go down the hill to the town and have their teeth looked after by a French dentist. And in fact, this French dentist was later very helpful to some of the men who were escaping. And it seems as if they had quite some freedom to go in around the town and to go shopping. And even one story is that, from a local Frenchman, and one story is that they were often drinking in the pub down the hill. I find that's quite hard to believe, but maybe it's not often. Maybe it happened once. And then the photo on the left shows a football game in the snow. I don't know whether the football game genuinely happened in the snow, or the Red Cross photographer said, "Come on, come and have some fun in the snow." And the guy said, "Oh, for heaven's sake, are you crazy?" But anyway, they did it. They played quite a lot of football. So that's again February 1944, and then we move on to May, the 11th of May. So on the 11th of May, which is 4 weeks, just less than 4 weeks before D-Day. So the American Air Force throughout that period was bombing the railways and the railway stations across northern and eastern France, preparing for D-Day. And on the 11th of May, they bombed the railway at Épinal, the station, the marshalling yards. But also a number of bombs fell on the camp by mistake. It's not clear to me whether the Americans actually knew there was a prisoner of war camp there, just about a mile from the railway station, whether they knew that or whether they didn't know that. But anyway, having looked at the map, there's a number of bombs that fell on the camp. At least 58 prisoners of war were killed. I mean, it's also worth saying that around 200 French civilians were killed as well. So this is the Americans bombing their allies without the intention. And the on the photo on the right, you can see the scale of the damage, or some of the damage anyway. The buildings were destroyed, the barbed wire in some places was breached, and so large numbers of prisoners of war thought, well, this is an opportunity that's too good to miss. And somebody, as a Frenchman wrote, they took the key to the countryside, which is rather a nice way of writing it, of saying it. So they escaped out of the camp, scattered across the surrounding area, and were helped by the local French civilians, and got many of them got to Switzerland. So Switzerland, from this place called Épinal, Switzerland is at least 100 kilometers away to the south, slightly to the east, through kind of wooded hills and mountains, and then dropping down to a kind of flat area called the Belfort Gap, and then going up again to the Swiss frontier. So a lot of them, over a period of several weeks, they were walking this journey, being helped by the French civilians, being in some cases transported in groups, taken along by some very young French women who were helping the resistance in this part of France. And by the end of the summer, 500 of them had reached Switzerland. And I know the names of all of those 500 because the Swiss kept record cards for them. So we have this fantastic archive in the Swiss National Archives. Every prisoner who crossed into Switzerland, they wrote out a card for them with their basic information. So it tells you where they were from and what their name and what religion and which regiment, and so on. So 500 of them got to Switzerland. And that makes this the single largest successful prisoner of war escape of the Second World War, full stop. And, is it a story that you know about? Is it a story that anyone else knows about? No, thank you, Ajay. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's people talk about The Great Escape, the extraordinary film with Steve McQueen on the motorcycle, a very good film. The amount of prisoners of war who got home from that was 3, and then there were 50 of them who were murdered by the Nazis, and that was around the same time. I mean, their escape was slightly earlier than this. It was in April of 44. And then there's what is often considered to be the greatest escape is is an escape that happened from Slovenia, an escape of British and Commonwealth other ranks from Slovenia across to Italy and then by plane. And that was 100 and something who escaped successfully. So, this story is a story that really needs to be known. So here they are, safe in Switzerland. Here's some of them. These are so they were taken into Switzerland, and they were put in a number of camps initially in the north of Switzerland and then later on in the southeast of Switzerland. On the left, you see some of the Sikh prisoners with some of their Swiss guards. I mean, I use the word guards, but, they were kind of hosts, really. And on the right, a soldier who one of the when I did my research in India last year, one of the commanding officers said, "Oh yeah, he's from Rajasthan, definitely a Rajput, this one, because of his moustache." That may or may not be true, but this is the process of the process of delousing, which they went through when they arrived in Switzerland, where all of their clothes were put through a chemical process to get rid of the lice. So they were very happy there in Switzerland. They were looked after. They didn't stay there very long, in fact. By September of that year, the invasions of France from the north and from the south had reached the Swiss frontier, and they were able to go through by train through Geneva down to Marseille, back to India, and they were all safe, all of those 500 men. So I'm going to tell you about one of them in particular, this gentleman here, Jalal. So his story is a story that really caught my attention for many reasons, and became something of a little Twitter storm last year when I was in India doing my research. So he was a lance naik, a lance corporal in the service corps. He was captured in North Africa, in Al Alamein, in the summer of 1942. He was put in camps in Italy, then in Germany, and he was part of that escape from Épinal in May of 1944. He didn't get to Switzerland. He took a slightly different route, and the story that he told, and the story was that he was in a town, a village called Bouligné, which is south of Épinal, and he met and married a local girl, and with her brothers, he led a French resistance group. And he also, there's another document in the archives in London of how he crashed a Jeep later. And because of this, he was awarded the Indian Order of Merit, not for crashing the Jeep, but for his work with the resistance. He was awarded the Indian Order of Merit, which was at that stage the second highest award that an Indian soldier could get, which was a really quite substantial accolade. And I think if anyone wants to make a film about, if you're looking for, well, you're in Bollywood, aren't you? If you're looking for a subject for a film, then this man has got to be part of it. So now the interesting thing is that this is his version from Fauji Akhbar. So Fauji Akhbar was the army news published every week for the army in different languages. And this is his story that he told when he got back to India. So he said that that this girl Denise found him in a barn. She had a dog with her, and he was in the barn having a sleep. And he opened his eyes, and there was this dog, and there was this beautiful French girl. Of course, they fell in love instantly. Now, interestingly, according to this, she said to him, "So you're one of these soldiers who escaped from Épinal?" And he said, "No." He said, "No, I'm a captain in the Indian Army, and I've been sent here to help lead the resistance." Quite why he said that, I don't know, but it's interesting that he reports himself doing this. So and then according to the story, he led the resistance group, and then they got married in the local church. That's his story. Unfortunately, that story is not confirmed. And this is just worth saying, these are other archives. So this is there are other ways of looking at the story. So on the right, the photograph is of the confirmation of the Indian Order of Merit. And on the left, this is a photo of me last year with his family. So I had a very interesting time in India last year, including briefly in Mumbai, researching, trying to find records of prisoners, trying to find family of prisoners. And this was the only success I had in terms of finding family, partly because of, in the middle of that photo, Lieutenant Colonel Dilbag Dabas, who was extremely helpful. So his family lives in west of Delhi in Haryana, and they confirmed many details of the story that was in the report that he'd told. And they showed me photos of him, and absolutely fascinating to meet them and to have this story confirmed for me. But then when I went to France last year, also to try and triangulate this story, then it didn't quite match. So Denise Nede was, she was there. This is her cousin. Her family still live in the same village. They remembered him. They remembered Jailal. They remembered him being there that summer. But there was no wedding in their memory. There was no children in their memory. There was just some flirting, as they described it. And also, I went to the local, the mairie, the local council office, and looked at the records of marriages and of births, and there was no record of Denise getting married, or having any children in that time. Very difficult. There was a resistance group, that's for sure. And the nephew whom I met showed me some press cuttings and was able to confirm that, but there was no memory that Jailal was a leader in that resistance group. So, this is a really difficult problem for a historian when you are given different versions of a story. How can you weave your way through that? And of course, I have to say, I'm a white British guy. I'm not Indian. I'm not French. I'm trying to find the right way to present this story without misrepresenting. So in fact, what I ended up doing in the book was to say, here are these versions of the story. I leave it to you, the reader. That was my approach in the end to that story. So that's the wonderful story of Jailal. And then, how are we doing for time? I need to wind up quite soon, don't I, AJ? Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just going to show you some concluding thoughts. So this photo on the right is another favorite photo of mine. This is two soldiers. This is in Britain in 1940. This is one of the soldiers from Force K6 meeting a British soldier from the British Army. Both of these guys had been veterans of the First World War and were now in the Second World War as well. Anyway, so that's my first kind of concluding thought is what does a historian do when you have conflicting versions of one story? It's very difficult, and it's a great subject for historians to discuss. Also, just really to make the point that British history and South Asian history are intimately connected. When you're talking about what Khaki does, and you're talking about the walking tours in Mumbai, you're talking about the colonial heritage, whether you like it or not. When we in Britain talk about, the history of the empire, then this is intimately connected. Our previous prime minister, with Indian heritage, the mayor of London, with Pakistani heritage. These things go together. You can't separate them out. And also then the substantial contribution of India, and when I say India, I mean what we would now call South Asia, to the two world wars. 4 million men in the First World War and the Second World War, a total of 4 million men contributing to the British, to the empire effort. And then the question really that continues to fascinate me, and maybe a question you might want to respond to, is why these stories are not known here or there. Why are these stories not known in Europe nor in South Asia? I've got some ideas on that, but I'm always interested to hear new ideas on that. And whether these stories are hidden or what is the right word? I'm kind of I like to use I tend to use the word untold. That's my preferred word, I think. Hidden, I think, implies that there is actually somebody who's trying to hide them, and I'm not sure that that's really true. Lost, to some extent, lost. Yeah, I mean, there are documents. I mean, I continue to be positively surprised by documents, by memories, by all kinds of little bits of film, photographs, artifacts, items, which are around, which do tell these stories. So why have they been forgotten? And as I said, I think these stories would make some amazing films, some great films. I challenge you, Bollywood. I challenge you to make something of these stories. That's it. This is the last photo is his name was Harbaksh Singh, and he is skiing in Switzerland after a successful. He wasn't an Épinal escapee. He was another escapee. He escaped from a different prisoner of war camp, and he was photographed skiing in the mountains of Switzerland. And I just love that photograph. So there's my email address. You can find me on Twitter. You can find my website. I'm very happy to hear from you. And yeah, I'd like to hear your questions, your comments. AJ.
Yeah, what a fascinating talk. I was just blown away by this Epinal story. And I think a lot of the folks on this call are voicing the same sort of sentiment. Interestingly, Naina Manjrekar has just posted saying, I was speaking to somebody yesterday who wants to make a film on Indian POWs. So Naina, you know where to reach out to Ghee. He's got his contact details on this. So I'm sure he'd appreciate
Absolutely.
an introduction. Um, I mean, this is just amazing. And I was going through it and I was wondering the same question you had, Ghee, which is why are these stories not known? Why are they not told? And you said you had a theory about it. What's your theory about that?
Okay, so I mean, I think it's a complicated theory, unfortunately, but it's partly it's to do with so in terms of in South Asian terms, it's to do with national construction, I suppose you might say, and how India, Pakistan, and then later Bangladesh wanted to remember the time of being part of the British Empire and the time of partition and the time and what happened around that. So the first time I came to India, when I was doing research for this book, I was very struck. I went into a bookshop in Jaipur and I went looking for the books about the Second World War. So in every bookshop in Britain, you have shelves and shelves and shelves of books about the Second World War. And I went into this bookshop in Jaipur looking for the books on the Second World War, and I found 3 books. Instead of there being 13 bookshelves, there were 3 books, and very interesting they were as well. But it just didn't feature. What did feature, of course, was 1947 partition. So this is how people in your country and indeed Pakistan see the 20th century. Is it's all that happens. 47 is the important year, and what happened in the Second World War and indeed in the First World War, was in some way preparation for that, and leading up to that, but less important than that. But then the other part, I think, is the importance, or another part, is the importance of Subhas Chandra Bose and the Indian National Army, and how important, so last year in Delhi, I went to visit India Gate, and there's a new statue there that wasn't there before, to Bose himself. And I was in Palampur, right up in the north of India, and there's a memorial to men from that area who were in the Indian National Army. But there's nothing like that to all the men who were part of what some people call the British Indian Army. So in terms of how India wants to see itself, how India wants to see the decolonization process, these guys, you know, you can see them as traitors. You can see them as, you know, kind of fighting on the wrong side. You can see them as, you know, just being on the wrong side of history. That's part of the answer, I think.
No, I think it's fascinating you say that. And Sri has just posted something that I think I'll read out because it resonates with what you've just said. And so what Sri writes is, in response to Dr. Bowman's question why these stories are not better known in India, some historians much better known than I am have suggested that because independence came so soon after World War II, it was necessary for nation building to support a narrative of India having been united in fighting for independence. That did not sit well with the narrative of having been part of the Allied fighting army. So the World War II experience, uniquely among countries that participated, has not been emphasized in national memory.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the Red Fort trials, you know, the importance of the Red Fort trials and how, you know, Nehru himself was involved in those trials and how that was, and how there was a big shift in public opinion in India, you know, at that time, you know, kind of an extraordinary change, really. Yeah, I think that's really accurate.
Right. But I think from Khaki's vantage point, as we're seeing it, there's a lot of demand for authentic stories about our history and our heritage to now be told. And I think this is a great time for these kinds of stories to come out. So, Naina, please make that introduction happen. I'd love to see a movie happen on this topic.
Yeah, and I think that,
yeah.
Sorry, just to add to that, really, you know, the demand for authentic stories. When I was looking for Jailal's family last year, and I put out some tweets, there was an enormous response to that. You know, that I think people were kind of interested in the individuality and the specificity of this one man and his story, and, you know, the kind of looking for his family. That kind of, yeah, it went beyond the sort of politics, if you like. Yeah.
So Naina had a question which is similar to another question that was asked earlier, which is had a question about which archives to look for these stories in, both in India, Britain, Germany, and elsewhere. I would love to hear Dr. Bowman speak a little bit about this.
Oh, well, it's an absolutely enormous task. I would welcome if you're looking for specific links, then please, you know, send me an email. But most of what I found, so in Britain, it's the India Office records are in the British Library. Then the National Archives, which are in Southwest London in Kew, and then the Imperial War Museum. Most of those sources are not digitized. Some of them are, but mostly you have to go there in order to look at them. And to, you know, there are also interesting audio interviews. So Dr. Mazumdar, for example, who was one of a different prison story that I haven't told. He's got an audio interview, but that's not online. Yeah, so that's the places in Britain. The National Archives of India in Delhi was pretty useful. Lots of stuff in there. I also went to regimental centers for different parts of the army. So I went to the Marathas. I went to the Service Corps, which is in Bangalore, and different regiments. That was quite useful. In Europe, the German military archives are in Freiburg. They were quite useful, but really in Switzerland, probably the best and most interesting were in Switzerland. So the Red Cross archives, which are in Geneva, and then the Federal archives, which are in Bern, the capital. And the Red Cross photo archives are online and very easily searchable. So if you want a link to that, just send me an email or have a look online. They're actually remarkably easy to find. Some really good photos of Indian soldiers after they've reached Switzerland. Well, no, not just after they've reached Switzerland, but also when they were in camps in different places.
Right.
And then, sorry, but let me just add to that is that as a historian, what I'm interested in is bringing together those documents in archives with, you know, interviews and first-hand encounters. So actually, you know, meeting people who are the children of these veterans is also just as interesting.
Right. I think there's another question from Commander Mohan Narayan that asks, well, thank you, Dr. Bowman, for an most interesting talk. May I request you to please tell us about the Free India Legion, Indians who fought for Germany in World War II, especially at their deployment at the Atlantic Wall during D-Day.
So there was around 3,000. So of the 15,000 Indian prisoners of war held by the Germans, around 3,000 were recruited by Subhas Chandra Bose, and were given German uniforms and trained to use German weapons. Most of their officers were German, and they had a number of interpreters, and it was the interpreters who have given us quite a lot of the documentary records of these guys. There's also lots of photos of them. And they were initially deployed, after training, they were deployed in the Netherlands, and then they were moved down to southwestern France, so just south of Bordeaux. So they were there, and that's where they were when D-Day happened in June of 1944. And they never really saw active service. They were then withdrawn back across France to Germany when they were attacked by Free French troops and had some encounters there, and a few lost their lives and some of them switched sides. And they went back into Germany at the end of 1944, and eventually were captured or recaptured by French troops mostly, and American and British, in kind of May of the end of the wars, April, May 1945. And then, in common with most of the Indian prisoners of war who were who'd been recovered in Europe, they went to England. So there was camps in the east of England, and about 10,000 Indian prisoners of war went through those camps. And there they were sorted by the British intelligence services. And those who were deemed to have been traitors then, well, they all came back to India then. And those who were deemed to have been traitors were part of that large number. They joined the INA troops from Burma, who were then kind of imprisoned, but then in due course were freed. So they didn't really have much military service. Hitler was quite rude about them. Bose himself was there initially, and then of course he went off on his epic submarine voyage to Asia, where he went in a German submarine round the Atlantic, and then they met up with a Japanese submarine in the sea in the south of the Indian Ocean, which then took him on to Singapore, and in due course to Tokyo. So a minor role really, but interesting how successful the Germans were in recruiting Bose and the others of the what was it called, the Freies. There was also an Indian bureau, an Indian office in Berlin. How successful they were in recruiting Indian soldiers.
What was, I mean, this is a throwback to the earlier part of your presentation, really, which occurred to me, is that what was the relationship like between the Indian soldiers and the British officers and the counterparts? Any cultural language barriers that had to be overcome?
Between the British officers and the Indian soldiers, generally fairly good. I mean, I think the most of the British officers, both in Force K6 and in the broader Indian Army, had been in the Indian Army for quite a while, quite a long time, and had a good understanding of language, culture, dietary needs, and so on. And so, you know, they were kind of, so for example, looking back at Force K6 and thinking about them in France and then in Britain, you know, they were well tuned in, and the relationships were pretty good. And then, of course, as the war went on, more and more Indians were becoming officers as well. So that made that cultural gap less. I mean, of course, there was a language barrier. You know, the language the amount of English that the Force K6 who were in Britain, the amount of English that they spoke is not entirely clear to me, but I think in some cases it wasn't very much to begin with, but increased as the war went on, and they were all given English lessons, and there was a group of them who were trained as English instructors, so they would learn, they would learn and then teach their colleagues. I mean, it was always an important thing for the British, for the Raj, for the British government, to keep the Indian army happy, which was, and to keep morale up. So that kind of those parallel ideas of food and culture and integration and language and so forth were really held to be really important by the British structure.
Right.
Didn't always work, but yeah, very important. I mean, I suppose it's worth saying that, of course, when they're in North Africa, a substantial part of the British effort in North Africa, and indeed some of the original soldiers in North Africa were Indian. But that army in North Africa was incredibly multicultural. So you had, apart from British, you had Australians and New Zealanders, South Africans, East Africans, West Africans, Palestinians, Jews and Arabs. People from across the empire and substantial amounts of Indians as well. So that whole kind of, which must have been, Cairo in 1942 must have been the most extraordinary place to be. So that kind of multicultural nature was really an important part of the calculations and the planning of the British Raj, the British command.
Right. I mean, in fact, you took the next question out of my mouth, which is what I was going to ask is, how was the experience in Europe for the Indian Army soldiers any different from the experience in other theaters of war, like Africa or Asia? And I think one you said is that very different from a multicultural setting perspective. Any other challenges specific to Europe, perhaps, that was different from the settings in Africa or Asia?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things about the escape and the prisoner of war escapees is that these guys, they stood out. If you're trying to walk across France, and you've got brown skin and you don't speak much French or English, and you don't know the custom and the culture, you're kind of quite noticeable. I mean, this guy Harbach Singh, he in the photo we're looking at. Interestingly, he's not wearing his turban in that photograph, but he walked for several days across France wearing his turban. And then he borrowed a hat from a French farmer and put on top of it to kind of try and hide it, But I mean, I think that's, these stories are just extraordinary, really. I think that's a kind of interesting contrast. Yeah. I think that, but that whole kind of multicultural, this was a world war. Everyone. So most countries were actively involved, and those countries that weren't actively involved were involved in some other way. So places like France, Germany, Italy, North Africa. They had people from everywhere who was passing through. So that I think that was kind of part of the education, really. Of the Indian soldiers and part of the education of the people from there. There's one rather lovely story, which is of an Italian film director whose name I can't remember at the moment. An Italian film director who was filming in India in the 1950s, and he was driving and he got into a bit of an argument with a Sikh lorry driver. And the Sikh lorry driver started insulting him in Italian because this guy had been a prisoner of war in Italy. Which was such a lovely idea.
Well, fascinating stories. So many, so much of appreciation for the talk. Sri says, in addition to Dr. Bowman's question, I certainly didn't know the story till it was posted on Twitter some months before the release of his book. Thank you, Dr. Bowman, for your research. Naina says, thank you, Dr. Bowman. Absolutely fascinating talk. Then she asked a question on archives, which you did address already, so I won't read that out. Mridula says, very interesting presentation. Siddharth, fascinating stories and great presentation. Thank you, Dr. Bowman. So all around, there's been a lot of appreciation, I think, for the talk. I mean, I was just certainly fascinated by this. I think I'm going to rush out and buy the book right away. Uh, and like I
Well,
said, I hope it gets. Sorry.
let me just say that the first book is
Yeah.
available in India. So this is
Okay.
this is the British edition, but there is an Indian edition published by Pan Macmillan. So you can buy that in Mumbai. But this book isn't yet. So this is the British edition. The Indian edition will be hopefully out. Well, some stage in the autumn. It's going to be published by Westland and should be out in the autumn.
Will they be published on Kindle as well?
Yes, you can get the British
Okay.
edition on Kindle. I'm not sure if the Indian edition will be on Kindle. I hope so.
Okay. Well, Vinayak Hegde says, I have a copy of the Indian edition, can show the cover. Interesting. One last comment to read from KV Ramesh, which is really addressed to uh, the command earlier, which is Rudolf Hartog, sign of the book is called Sign of Tiger Covers Free India Legion.
Very
Okay.
good book. Very interesting.
So I had one last question, really. I've been dying to ask this question, which is, did the uh, well, did their experience in World War II shape in any form? And I don't know if you know the answer to this, but did the Indian Army's experience in World War II shape in any way its future development and modernization after independence in India? Any lessons that it took really from the World War II experience?
Oh, that is a good question. Yes, without a doubt. I mean, all of the senior officers in the Indian Army and in the Pakistan Army in the period from 1947 until probably at least the 1960s were all. Thank you, Vinayak. Thank
Thank you,
you.
Vinayak.
um, yeah, those senior officers were almost entirely men who had been in the British Indian Army during the war, and indeed before the war. So people like Anis Ahmed Khan, who was in Force K6, who became a prisoner, and who then went on to be the director of supply and transport in the Indian Army in the 1950s. People like lots of guys who'd been prisoners in Italy, who were senior officers. Um, so they'd been brought up with Indian officers, with British officers. In some cases, they'd been educated at Sandhurst, which is the British equivalent of Dehradun, and they had learned their trade, with British around them. And if it was very interesting going to lots of different regimental centers around India last year and seeing the extent to which the the battles of the First World War and the Second World War, and of course before that, are still remembered and still honored by the Indian Army until now, and how that tradition was, of course, independent Indian Army was independent, but the tradition was there, and how much English is still used within the army, and how much things have evolved slowly. But there's a massive connection there, massive connection.
So I'm going to end this with on a lighter note from a comment here. Do you know what it's going to be, Ghee? Can you guess what my question is going to be?
I think it's going to be one of two things. Either it's going to be asking me how I got started on this project, or it's going to be where does my name come from?
I think the second question is the one, but I'd love to hear your answer to the first one too before you answer the second one.
So the question was about my name, was it?
It was.
Okay. So briefly, I started this because I live in Exeter, which is a small town in the southwest of England. I was doing a project about the multicultural history of this city. This is more than 10 years ago now. And while I was doing that project, I found some photos of Force K6 in this part of the country. And I was just so fascinated by that. When the project finished, I went and did a master's, and then I did a PhD, and that became the book. My name, my birth certificate, my parents called me John Bowman. And when I was very little, I used to say Agi. So my sister said, "Oh, let's call him Ghee." So it started as a nickname, and the spelling was just because my parents thought, well, that's the right way to spell it if you want to do that sound in English. It started as a nickname, and then because it was always the name that I'd always been known by, it stuck, and then eventually I changed it. And then I think, but I always knew that it meant clarified butter. But there was when first time I came to India, and I had a conversation, and I realized, hang on a second, okay, so what does ghee mean? It means sweet, it means a little bit fat, and it means clear. And I thought, okay, yeah, I can live with that. That's not a bad collection of words to describe myself.
Well said. Well, thank you so much for such a wonderfully entertaining and enlightening evening. Thanks to all of you for having joined us this evening, and see you on our next talk next week. But Ghee, thank you so much. It's been fun. It's been great having you.
My great pleasure. Thank you, AJ, for hosting us.
Bye-bye. Have a nice weekend, everyone.
Nice to see you all. Bye-bye. Please get in touch if you have any questions.